And we've been looking at, we were looking at this little section of parables dealing with prayer, and we were ending with the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, or the Pharisee and the tax collector. You notice it comes right after, of course, one we looked at before that, the parable of the, sometimes called the unjust judge, or the persistent widow. And you'll notice he begins this parable of the Pharisee and the publican. Also, he spoke this parable. And that word also indicating there is some connection, obviously, between the two. And whether, we don't really know whether that's chronologically, whether he told them at the same time, or Luke just included it here because of the subject matter. As you know, the Oriental mind of that day and age, when they recorded history and events, doesn't operate like ours. You know, critics of the Bible who have a very shallow knowledge, well, and actually sometimes they do know, they just are dishonest in their evaluation. But they'll make allegations based on chronology or other things when they didn't necessarily write chronologically like we do. We like things, you know, this happened in this order, and that's not the way the Bible's written. It's not, the books are not in order. And a lot of material in individual books are not in order. The book of Judges has material that's not in order. The book of Job did not occur after most of Israel's history. Job was a patriarch who probably lived at or before the time of Abraham. You know, if we were going to do it chronological, we'd have to take all the prophetic books and place them somewhere, you know, in 1st and 2nd Kings, you know, and try to insert them, you know, when these prophets lived and prophesied. But that's not the way it's arranged, and even in individual books, they're not always written chronologically. So it's hard to know here, but while this parable of the Pharisee and the tax collectors we mentioned last week, we lumped it in with the parables on prayer, and it is in the prayer setting, but that's not really the point or the purpose of the parable. If you read it, it looks like the purpose of the parable is stated at the beginning, and the point of the parable is stated at the end. Let's read it again. We've covered a lot of these things, and we won't go back over them. We talked about who the Pharisees were and the publicans and so forth. We'll not go back through those things. But let's read it again. Also, he spoke this parable. Here's the purpose. He spoke this parable to some who what? Trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, and we talked quite a bit last week about the Pharisee, right? We talked about, it says he goes up. We mentioned that they went up to the temple to pray. Obviously, if you were going up to Mount Moriah, you went up topographically. And that's the way, again, the Bible talks about things. It doesn't talk north and south like we do, up and down. When it says up and down, it means literally, you know, elevation. If you went from Jerusalem to Jericho, you went what? Jericho's where in regard to Jerusalem? Directionally, where is it? Well, it's east, right? But it says that, you know, we get to the parable of the Good Samaritan, which we will here in the next week or two. It says that they went where? They went down. Well, they went down elevationally, topographically. So if you were going to the temple, you went up. Regardless of what direction you were coming from, you went up, as far as these writers were concerned. They went up to the temple to pray. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men. He uses the word I about 5 times. Extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. We know that they were only required to fast once a year on the Day of Atonement, but twice a week. Monday and Thursday, supposedly Moses went up to Mount Sinai on Monday and came down on Thursday. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the tax collector standing afar off. Now the publican makes sure he gets right in the center. The Pharisee gets right in the center, near the altar, right? Everybody can see him, all eyes on him. The tax collector won't do that. He stands afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast repeatedly, the Greek language indicates there, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Literally, the Greek text says, is the definite article. He says, be merciful to me, the sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other, for everyone who exalts him. Now, here's the point. Purpose, he spoke to some who trusted in themselves, they were righteous, despised others. Well, what's the point? For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Well, we looked quite a bit at the attitude last week of the Pharisee. We noticed his prayer consisted of imperfect goodness, we called it, but really it was all about negative conduct, right? It was all about what I don't do, right? I don't do these things. Well, here's the question, Mr. Pharisee. What do you do, right? What do you do? Christianity is to be a religion of service. And we prove our love for God and Christ by the things we do for others. James chapter 2. You know, you say you love your brother, right? He has need, and I say what? Be warmed and filled. Go on your way, and I don't do anything for it. But the Pharisee's all about the things, and there's a lot of people like that in the religious world, in this country, in the church. Well, I don't do this, I don't do that, I don't do that. Well, what do you do? Well, I come every time the door's open, I sit in the pew. Okay. But again, what do you do? So he was all about what he didn't do. Well, he looks around, of course, as an insecure and immature person would, whose method of making himself feel better about himself will compare himself to somebody he knows is beneath him, right? Make others feel bad so I can feel good. So he looks around and he casts his eyes upon the easiest thing he can find. Remember, the Pharisees, even though they were hypocritical, even though they were more about their own traditions than they were the Word of God, they had deceived, if you will, the eyes of an ignorant people. And political leaders do that today. And to the people, they were so spiritual. And they were respected, even though they were religious show-offs and arrogant and hypocritical. People couldn't see. All they saw was, man, this guy, he's the religious one. Right? He's wearing his robes, his phylacteries. He knows the law. You know, he's washing his hands. He's doing all this stuff. They had great respect for them. And the people despised tax collectors because they were Jewish, they were traitors, they were collecting Roman taxes from their own people. You couldn't get worse. You couldn't get lower than one of these guys. And so it's easy. The Pharisee looks around and says, oh, well, I'm better than he is. Right? Well, you haven't set the bar too high, Mr. Pharisee. It says he prayed with himself. It's kind of like he asked God, look, why don't you join my mutual admiration party here? You know, look how good I am. Compared to this guy, it's all about himself. So, I think when we were leaving last week, I asked this question, what did he actually ask for? I mean, read the prayer. What did this guy, he goes to the temple to pray, and what did he ask for? Huh? Nothing. He didn't make one request of God. Why? Why? He didn't need anything. He didn't need God. He was fine just the way he was. Why would you ask for something if you don't need it? Right? But that gets us to the tax collector. This guy's in trouble. And he knows it. He needs help. And the only place he can get it's from God. And so he stands removed from the altar. His head's dropped beneath his shoulders. He won't even look up. It reminds us of Ezra 9:6, Ezra prayed, O my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to Thee, my God, for my iniquities have risen higher, our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt is mounted up to the heavens. And he continually beats his chest, and he says, I am, God be merciful to me, the sinner. The sinner. No, that's not what it says. That's what your English Bible says, but that's not what the Bible says. Not the Greek Bible. It says, I be merciful to me, the sinner. Who does that remind you of? Who does that remind you of? Paul. Who in 1 Timothy 1:15 says what? I am the chief, or some translations say foremost, of sinners. Now that's a humble attitude. He wasn't, and look, he didn't look around. He wasn't comparing himself to the Pharisee or anybody else. He wasn't looking for anybody else. His only concern was his relationship with who? God. That was it. His only concern was his relationship with God. Therefore, Jesus said, you got two different prayers, two different attitudes, and therefore you got two different what? Two different results. Right? He says you got two different results. I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house what? Justified, declared righteous, rather than the other. I mean, after all, the Pharisee didn't ask for anything, did he? He didn't ask for anything. He didn't need anything. He went away unhelped and unblessed, just the way he came. Cold. This other guy went up to the temple because he had to go. Things weren't right in his life. He wanted to reestablish his relationship with his God. And according to Jesus, his relationship was reestablished. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Humility, and that's the point here, there's no place for boasting before God. Worship's not a show. If anything, we ought to be ashamed of our own shortcomings, agonizing over our spiritual blunders. But God will reward those who are truly humble, and humility will lead us, I can think of at least two things. Maybe three things, but one thing, and closely related, something else. Humility will lead us to knowledge. Why do I say that? Why would humility lead me to knowledge? Well, it's hard to learn anything if I already know it all, right? You ever met a know-it-all? Can't tell them anything? You're not going to learn anything if you already know everything, right? Why would I need to know anything else? Why would I listen to you? And I would add along to that, it will lead to self-improvement. Same concept. If I'm already like this Pharisee, if I've already arrived, if I'm already the standard by which everybody else ought to behave and live and talk and act, then why would I need to change anything in my life? So you're not going to learn and you're not going to improve without a little humility, because you have to admit that we have to admit that we're not there yet. Yeah.
Yeah, it also leads to you treating people better.
Yeah. And that's obviously a byproduct of it, is our relationship with other people, obviously. And really what I'm trying to focus on in the first two is our relationship with God. Because if I'm not willing to learn, if I'm not willing to do better, but yes, as a byproduct, anytime my relationship improves with God, and my attitude improves toward God, it will necessarily improve my relationship and attitude toward other people. No question. But in the end, I guess, the major point is humility leads to God. We need a sense of our own inadequacy to cope with life. In other words, we have to be willing to... In the long ago, when Moses appeared, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh. And they said, God has said, let my people go. What was Pharaoh's response? What was the first thing out of his mouth? Who is the Lord? Right? Who is He to tell me what to do? So if we don't admit, it's like we talked about before. We talked about it. You talk about it in personal evangelism. We mentioned it in here. People are not going to respond to the gospel unless what? They finally realize what? That they're in sin. And that they need it. That they have to have it. That they're separated from God without it. We live in a society now that the word sin, I mean, other than the Bible and other than coming here and in your own congregations if you're not from here and you talk about sin, who talks about sin? So you tell your buddy next door, you need to obey the gospel. Why? Well, because you don't want to die in your sins. Well, what's that? Sin. We have to understand our inadequacy. And that leads us to the sin part. We have to have a consciousness of our own sin. And understand we're in sin. And that we can't pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. That's what this tax collector realized. I was reading a commentator that had an interesting take on the evolution of Paul's attitude of humility. And I don't know if it, and I have to do a little more study on it, but it's an interesting concept I will throw out to you. If you go to Galatians 1 verse 1, how does Paul describe himself? Anybody know? What does he call himself? Paul and what? An apostle. Well, how many people in this world ever were apostles? How many apostles have ever lived? Total. Just give me the total. 14, right? 14. Judas fell away. Matthias got appointed. Paul was one born out of due season. Out of the 7 billion people that are on earth today and maybe the 40 billion people that have ever walked this earth, there's been 14 apostles. Do you think, now what was an apostle? Okay, he was given authority. Paul says, I'm an ambassador. An ambassador is an authorized representative of government who speaks on behalf of his government to other nations and has the authority to do so. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, he has that authority. But our ambassadors that are scattered all over the world, if they get something from the State Department that says, you go tell that other government this, it's just as if the president is talking to them. And when an apostle spoke to you while inspired in the first century, that was the same as Jesus talking to you. Now, I'm not saying everything he said was inspired, but when he was a walking Bible. He had authority. No office like it since. Do you think it would be possible just to have a little bit of pride about that. I mean, I run into people every day that think they're all that just because they're whatever, you know. Well, I'm a lawyer, I'm a judge, I'm a doctor. Okay, big deal. You know what? If something happened to you tomorrow, the world would go on. It's one thing I've learned about having an office across from a funeral home and a cemetery. I've watched many a funeral service pull into that cemetery. And you know what else is going on Poplar Avenue while they're having a funeral graveside service? Cars are just whizzing by. People are just going on about their day. Well, I suspect it would be tempting to have a little pride and arrogance to be an apostle. And so what did Paul have to keep him from getting the big head? He had a thorn in the flesh, right? So he says, I'm an apostle. 1 Corinthians 15:9, though, he says, all of a sudden, I'm least of the apostles. Unfit to be an apostle. Then in Ephesians 3:8, he says, further, I'm the very least of all the saints. Man, you're really falling, Paul. First you're an apostle, now you're least of the apostles, now you're least of all the saints. And in 1 Timothy 1:15, which we've already quoted today, he said what? I'm the foremost, I'm the chief of sinners. Now, let's call that a progression. Maybe. Let's assume that as the older he got, his attitude developed, changed. What do you think changed his attitude? What do you think changed his attitude about who he was and what his worth was? And this humility. Well, let me ask you this. Do you think as the older Paul got, he got closer to Christ or further away from Christ? I would think we could say without doubt he got closer to Christ. Do you think it's possible that the closer we get to the Lord and we can see the difference between Him and ourselves, that might make us a little humble? The closer I get to Christ, the more time I spend in His Word and in prayer, and I appreciate His perfection and His holiness. And I look at my own life and I see where I fall short and I come up short. I would think that might be the cure for all self-satisfaction and self-congratulations like this Pharisee had. If he had just compared himself to Christ, he might say, I got a long way to go. And maybe I don't need the big head.
Might be too that, there could be any number of reasons why people do that. Just age has a tendency to do that too.
Yeah.
But also, none of the other apostles ever had to run into people families of people they persecuted.
Yeah.
And he had to run into Christians all over the place that he had possibly done away with their family.
Yeah, no question. Certainly age. The longer we live, the more self-reflection we're probably going to engage in. Well, think about Jesus and that woman caught in adultery. Who's the guys that left the scene first? Obviously the ones that were older. But as you say, Paul's traveling around, especially when he was in Judea and maybe all the way to Syria. I don't know about over as he got toward Europe, but it's possible. People move around. But yeah, you run into people that, hey, guess what? I killed your dad. Oh, I'm glad you're a Christian. I put your mom in prison. That might sting a little bit. Might sting your your psyche and your pride a little bit. Pharisee and the publican. Well, we're going to move away from prayer parables. We're going to look at a few that we might call stewardship. Parables involving stewardship. Let's turn over to Matthew 25. And it's interesting, this one though is really, it's not just on stewardship. Although we're going to call it one on stewardship. But it's closely related to another group of parables we're going to look at that we're going to call parables on preparedness, being ready. We're going to look about three of those. We're going to look about three of these on stewardship. But you know it happens in Matthew 25, or it occurs, it's given in Matthew 25, which means it's in what context? What context is this parable given? This is part of what discourse? Yeah, it's part of the Olivet Discourse, which took place in the last week of the Lord's life, Tuesday, I think. And so it's very closely aligned with the parables before it. And the parable before it is what? What's the parable before it? The 10 virgins. The 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins, which we'll get to when we talk about being prepared, being ready. But it's interesting, what we're going to see is the parable of the 10 virgins emphasize being ready. And what this parable tells us, well, while you're being ready, that doesn't mean just to sit there and do nothing. Okay. You're not being ready by being idle. You make yourself ready by being busy in the Lord's service and work. That's how you're really ready. And so there's a relationship there between these parables. Now there's a similar parable in Luke called the parable of the pounds in Luke 19. And we'll talk about that one too after this one. And some commentators have said, well, that looks to be like the same one, maybe just a little different. But the problem with that, of course, is they weren't given in the same setting. They're given on 2 different occasions. And there are quite a few differences in the parables, which we're not going to go into right now. But in the context, as I've already said, this parable is given in the Olivet Discourse the week of his death. So who's he talking to? Who's he talking to? Yeah, he's just talking to his own disciples, right? I mean, it's a more intimate group there. His own disciples. Go back to the beginning of chapter 24. But if you go to the parable of the pounds, there seems to be a mixed group there. It's not as a private conversation like this one. And it says that he told it because he was near to Jerusalem and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. And so it looks to me like these are 2 separate parables. So let's look at this one, beginning in verse 14. For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country. Well, who was going to the far country? Who's the man? Christ. He's going to a far country. He's going away. He's going to heaven. Who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them, and to one he gave 5 talents. Now, talent, what is a talent? What's a talent? In this context, in the Bible. It's money, right. And most commentators believe it was somewhere worth about $1,000 or more. So it's a lot of money. In that day and age, a day's wage was 17 cents. So it's a lot of money. Now, we use the word talent differently today. But he's given them money. to another 2, and another 1. Each, now, this is where you might get down to the talent business, like we think about it. He gave them this money based on what? The amount he gave them was based on what? Yeah, to each according to his own ability. Well, that tells me right there, I don't have to go any further to know that God knows what I'm capable of. And He doesn't expect more from me than what I'm capable of. But He does expect something. He expected something out of all 3 of these fellows. And he went on his journey. Then he who had received the 5 went and traded with them and made another 5. And likewise he had received 2, gained 2 more also. But he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. It was judgment time. Notice, read that again, verse 19. After how, what? After what? A long time. There could be some delay in His coming. You know, there were some Christians in the first century that thought He was just coming back immediately. Paul had to write what book? 2 Thessalonians, right? Well, some of you quit work. Well, you know, if you don't work, neither should you eat, right? Some of you just quit work sitting around. You ever heard about these groups that, seemed like when I was growing up, you used to hear about a few groups that would go off to the Ozarks. Oh, we got a bunch of people going to the Ozarks next month, don't we? But you're going to come back, I hope. They go off and get a cabin and provisions, and what are they waiting on? Well, somebody's told them that they figured it out. They know exact day and time He's coming back. Could be a while. So he who had received the 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I've gained 5 more talents beside them. His Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. Well, here's the point. Faithfulness. Faithful service. You could title this parable, Faithful Service. That's what he was looking for. You were faithful over a few things, I'll make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. You can come to the banquet, eat at my table. That's a big deal for a servant. He also, who had received 2 talents, came and said, Lord, you delivered me 2 talents. Look, I've gained 2 more besides them. His Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things, I'll make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Then he who had received the 1 talent came and started blaming his Lord for all of his shortcomings. Well, we've been doing that since Adam, right? It's your fault. You gave her to me. Lord, I knew you to be a hard man. Not only are you harsh, but you're unethical. Reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered. Oh, well, thank you for that, servant. I appreciate your assessment. And I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, you have what is yours. But his Lord answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy servant. Is it a good attribute to be lazy, by the way? God looking for lazy people? Do you know any lazy people? They're not Christ-like if they're lazy. Remember Mark? Mark wrote to the Roman mind. What word did he use over and over again? Yeah, straightway in the King James. Modern translations say what? Immediately. Hey, Romans, you're people of action. Guess what? Jesus is a man of action. He's always on the move. He's not lazy. You knew that I reap where I've not sown and gather where I've not scattered seed. So you ought to have done. Now, he's not admitting to the servant's assessment. What he's saying is, well, if that's the way you felt about it, and if that's what you thought I was, harsh, unethical, what should you have done? You ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant, he wasn't faithful, he was unprofitable, into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, there are some commentators that believed he was speaking this perhaps to the Pharisees and Jews who wouldn't give their allegiance to Christ, but I don't think so. I mean, he's talking to his disciples here on Olivet. He's talking to us. He's talking to those of us that follow Christ. So, looking at the gifts, I guess the first thing we ought to observe is that everybody got something. Right? Nobody was passed over. We've all been given opportunities and abilities, and I know some people have more than others. But no one's excused. God's got work for everybody, no matter who you are. And guess what? He'll give you the capital you need to do the job. He's got a job for us, and He'll make sure we have what we need to do it. But not everybody gets the same. He distributed this money based on their abilities. And as I said earlier, He doesn't expect of us what we cannot do. I like what William Barclay, the Scottish theologian, said. He said, we cannot be equal in achievement, but we can be equal in effort. And let me tell you, people say, don't talk about politics and don't talk about economics, but I'm telling you that only our form of government and free enterprise and capitalism will only work with one religion. Somebody says, why are we so prosperous? Why is the United States where it is in the world? It's because of the Christian religion. If you don't have Christianity, you have oppression and you don't have freedom. Whether you want to call it socialism or communism or whether it's Islam or whatever it is, but this idea of we all should be equal in results flies in the face of the Bible. He has never promised anybody and everybody that you will have the same thing as everybody else. What He says is, do with what I give you, and I will bless you. And your job is not to envy other people for what they have. Do I envy Elon Musk because he has a gazillion dollars? I'm sure Elon Musk has problems because he has that much money that I will never understand. But do I envy him? Especially if he earned it? Now, I realize some people they're given whatever. And so the socialist and the communist says, I will take the hard-earned money from you and give it to lazy people who don't want to work. Because that's only fair. It's not fair. It's not just, and it's not righteous. It is immoral. You can say what you want, but that's what the Bible teaches. Now, that doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to help people who are in need or need our help. But we are not to enable people who will not do what God expects them to do and get up and take care of yourself and your family. What does He say about the Christian who will not take care of his own family? He is worse than what? An unbeliever, an infidel. We may not have the same opportunities as others. We may not have the same abilities as others. But we've got some. He's given us something to work with, and He expects us to use it in His service. And here's the thing. Do we think this guy was afraid? How many people that don't have a lot, they say, oh, well, I just don't have much ability. I can't do anything. Right? It's hard, it's hard. Do we think it was any easier for the guys that had 5 and 2? Do we think they didn't have challenges? How many times have you read about people in this life, the earthly realm, that have risen, come from nothing, and made all kinds of money, overcoming all kinds of challenges and obstacles? Do we think that... See, I think sometimes people think just because somebody has money, well, they got it, it just came easy for them. That's not the way the world works. You know that. I know that. This man probably thought, well, it just came easy for them. They had an unusual run of luck. They had no temptations. Well, we know that's not true. You know why they were successful? They worked hard. Faithful service. He didn't have faith in himself. He was unsure of his own abilities. And notice he was afraid. And fear can freeze us. We just won't do anything, right? It's like the deer in the headlights. If I can't have the leading part, if I can't be in the front, I just don't want to be a part of it. Whatever. He didn't have the courage to work. He was afraid of work. Didn't have faith in his master. Said he was harsh, unethical. He viewed his master in light of his own envious and selfish nature. That was his problem. He thought his master was like him. But God's not like that. And see, God is not, and that's the way some people look at God. Man, He's hard. He expects too much. He just orders and demands things. The Bible teaches me that God is a Father, and He loves and He pities His children. And He understands us. And He extends mercy. And when He gives us something to do, He'll give us the wherewith to do it. Well, that's the second bell. So we'll pick up there next week.